I don't know if you've ever considered that as Christians, we build our lives entirely around something that we cannot see. We can't see it. Now, to be fair, I want to be honest, okay? I just said a moment ago, right, that the foundation of our lives, or the foundation of our faith, I should say, is the person of Jesus. We know that Jesus was an actual historical figure who lived in Israel in the first century. That is not up for dispute. Any credible historian, historians, people all around the world for thousands of years have agreed on the fact that Jesus was a real person who actually lived a revolutionary life, died on a cross, and then launched the movement that is the biggest global movement in the history of civilization. All that is historically true. And the reason I mention it is simply because not so much with your demographic in terms of your age, but a couple years ago, about a decade ago, there was this movement called the New Atheists who tried to undermine Christianity by doubting the existence of the person of Jesus. And I am all for people learning and discovering, we all got a lot to learn in life in terms of history and all that stuff, but that's just not true. That's literally, it's just not good scholarship or anything like that. So we know that the person of Jesus, real historical figure, therefore, who we follow and what we put our faith in, it's not all invisible. But with that said, the God that Jesus was claiming to reveal, we don't see him. That's the one that we don't see. When we pray and we say, Heavenly Father, we don't actually see that God the same way that we see each other. We don't perceive him the same way that we perceive the auditorium that we are in. That God we don't see. And to be honest, that is the reason, or that is at least part of the reason, why there are such a thing as atheists, right? Because if the creator of the universe revealed himself in a way where everyone could clearly see him, up in the sky, then nobody would have to believe in God. Everybody would just see God. There wouldn't be no such thing as, I don't believe in God. And as a matter of fact, I think for those of us who worship God, who trust God, who love God, who want to follow God, if we could see God, our lives would probably be filled with a lot more peace, a lot more comfort, and a lot more hope. Because even if you didn't have the answers to all the questions about life, even if you were going through difficult circumstances or seasons, I really believe that it would bring all of us a lot of hope and a lot of comfort if we could see someone up there and we knew he's up to something. If we could see him, but the reality is that we can't. And to make this conversation a little bit more confusing, there are moments all throughout the Christian and Jewish scriptures where people actually see God, where people would say, I actually saw the creator of the universe. And to be fair, these moments happen and they're probably a bit more diverse than you would assume that they are. As a matter of fact, if you read your Old Testament from cover to cover, you would probably conclude that most of the time when people claim to see God, they don't see a figure, they don't see an entity of any kind. What they actually see is they see activity in the world that they determine can only be attributed to God. They see situations play out in such a way where they go, that is God. And what we want to do this month, in the month of October, is we want to look at one biblical character, a gentleman by the name of Joseph. We want to spend the month of October looking at this individual named Joseph and basically ask the question, did you see God? Because if you know anything about Joseph, if you know anything about that historical figure, Joseph lived a life that none of us are going to sign up for. Joseph experienced some of the most unimaginable injustice compared to, he experienced more injustice and more mistreatment by the time he was 20 years old than most of us will experience in our entire lives. Joseph grew up in an extremely dysfunctional family. He had family drama that would probably make ours look silly. He was sold into slavery by his family. He spent time in jail for a crime that he did not commit. He helped people who were supposed to remember him and help him back in the future, and they totally forgot about him. Joseph's life was anything but perfect. He had his fair share of struggles and challenges and obstacles to overcome. And yet, I am absolutely convinced that if Joseph was here this morning, he would say that his life is one where you can see God all over the place. And yet, when you read about him, what you actually experience is something much more nuanced than that. So here's what I want to do this morning. This morning is just part one of a 5-part series that we'll talk about over the month of October. I just want us to look at the very beginning of Joseph's story. We're just gonna look at the start of the narrative. I'm gonna make a couple observations, and then we're gonna close out in prayer, and then you all can go out and hang out. Let's look at the start of Joseph's story, Genesis chapter 37, verse 2. Just so you know, for context, the story of Joseph is told in Genesis chapters 37 through 50. So if you wanna read about it this week, you can skip ahead, Genesis chapters 37 through 50. Here is verse 2. This is the account of Jacob. Jacob is dad. You'll realize that. This is the account of Jacob and his family. When Joseph was 17 years old, he often tended his father's flocks. He worked for his half-brothers, the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. To be honest, you could probably pronounce those words however you want, and no one's going to correct you. But Joseph reported to his father some of the bad things his brothers were doing. Pause there. He reported to his father some of the bad things his brothers were doing. First thing to note about the character of Joseph is that he's a bit of a snitch. Okay, if you thought this was gonna be like a hero story where we learn, how to live life from this courageous, perfect, unflawed individual, that is incorrect. Joseph, from the very beginning of his story, we are told, is a tattletale. If you remember that word from childhood, if you have siblings, you might understand the moment or relate to the scenario. Especially if you're the oldest sibling in the room, if you've ever had it happen where like you and your siblings, or you could even use cousins or whatever, like where you guys are playing and maybe you're like saying things or maybe like you guys are like kind of, I don't know, wrestling, whatever it is, and then you make your younger sibling cry, you make them cry, and immediately you know what you have to do as the older sibling in the moment, like you have to quiet them down, because if you make your sibling cry and they don't, they're not gonna win anymore, then what they do is they're gonna run and they're gonna tell mom and dad. And usually you have to do everything you can to try to stop that moment from happening. Joseph was the kid who ran to tell dad. Joseph was the kid who was like, hey, when I'm having problems with my brothers, I'm gonna get dad involved. And then I want you to keep reading. Look at how the story plays out. Verse 3. Jacob loved Joseph. This Jacob is the dad. Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other children because Joseph had been born to him in his old age. Weird, but okay. So one day, Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe. But his brothers hated Joseph because their father loved him more than the rest of them. They couldn't even say a kind word to him. Translation, we'll pause there. This is a very dysfunctional family dynamic, okay? The fact that the dad in the family loves one son so much more than all the other sons. If you can imagine waking up on Christmas morning and you and your 12 other siblings or 11 other siblings all line up and one of them gets a present and nobody else gets a present, that any licensed marriage and family therapist would say, this is dysfunctional. This is a recipe for disaster. This family is not going to end up well. And yet this is the family that Joseph is growing up in. And then verse 5, this is where it gets fun. One night, Joseph had a dream. And when he told his brothers about it, they hated him more than ever. Listen to this dream, Joseph said. We were out in the field tying up bundles of grain. Suddenly, my bundle stood up, and your bundles all gathered around and bowed low before mine. Now, I'm not going to read their response, but you can imagine how negative it is. Here is Joseph, dad's favorite child. And he has a dream about how all of his brothers, the bundles are supposed to be symbolic of the actual brothers. He has this dream of all of his brothers bowing down to him. If it's not enough that dad loves one kid more than all the other ones, Joseph goes on to say, hey, you all who are loved less than I am, you're actually all gonna bow down and serve me. The narrator actually records that after this incident, Joseph has another dream very similar, and he comes to the same conclusion. He shares the information with his brothers, and his brothers hate him all the more. Obviously, as it indicated, they couldn't even say a kind word to him. Now, there's something I have to point out before we can proceed with the narrative, okay? And that is that in the ancient world, particularly in this region of the world, dreams were significant. Dreams were not seen as just the activity of the subconscious or the unconscious mind when someone was sleeping. That's not what a dream was. Dreams were often understood to be visions and messages from God. So that means that any ancient reader who was going through this story, particularly within Judaism, any ancient reader who's reading the story of Joseph, they're gonna come to this part of the story and they're gonna go, oh, This is where God shows up. Notice, there's no visible manifestation of anything. There's no audible voice. There's no thunder. There's no lightning. There's none of that. There's a dream. And God gives Joseph this dream, and the dream, as I indicated, the dream was specific enough where Joseph and even his brothers kind of knew what it was about. Joseph and his brothers are able to determine the dream is a positive vision of Joseph's future. Somehow, some way in Joseph's future, he is ruling, he is reigning, he is in charge. It's specific enough to where they know kind of what the dream is about, but it's vague enough to where Joseph doesn't know exactly what he's supposed to do next. And if I can just have a little bit of a pause and take a pastoral moment, these are the very same kinds of dreams that myself, other leaders here, these are the same kinds of dreams that we pray you would all have. And I say, and maybe I'll specify dreams and visions, and I want to be specific because I don't want you to get caught up in how God communicates with Joseph. What I want to focus on is what God communicates to Joseph. It's a little unclear, but it is a positive picture from God about Joseph's future. And I actually have a ton of biblical precedents to believe that the dream or the type of dream that God gave Joseph, God wants to give all of us. Probably the clearest and most popular Bible verse on the subject on this subject is Jeremiah 29:11. It is famous in bios all across the world. This is God speaking. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. This is a very popular verse because it succinctly represents the heart of God as it relates to his people. God inspires the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah is a prophet. He hears a message from God, and he feels like he has to send this message to some of Jeremiah's own people, some of Jeremiah's own relatives who are living in slavery under an oppressive empire in the east. Jeremiah sends this message, and he says, hey, guys, God wanted me to tell you that he has good plans for you. He has a hope and a future that he wants to give you. These people who are receiving this message from Jeremiah, they are experiencing the most difficult circumstances they have ever experienced in their entire life. They are slaves. They do not have rights. They do not live in their homeland. They are very uncertain and afraid about their future. And yet God shows up with this message that goes, hey, right in the middle of your circumstance, I want to let you know that my heart is to give you good plans, or my heart it has good plans for you. My heart is to give you a good future. And if God said those things to those people in that moment, I have every reason to believe that he would say the same thing to all of us today. You know, the vision that God has for humans is probably one of the most underrated things about Christianity. Many people, when they think of Christianity, in our culture, you have all kinds of ideas. Some are positive, some are negative, some are neutral. But by and large, when many people think of Christianity and they think of kind of what it has to offer, well, you don't sin, okay? You don't sin. You stop doing that. You don't do the bad things. You go to church and you live by a certain moral ethic or a certain moral code. You do support certain causes and you don't support other causes. Some people associate Christianity with certain political agendas, all kinds of ideas. I think one of the most misunderstood and underrepresented aspects of our faith is the vision that God actually has for humans. Our worldview is the only worldview that is going to say, as a human being, you are valuable simply because you're human. Our worldview is going to be the only one that says, you don't have to make yourself matter to the world. You don't have to come up with your own identity or life or purpose or anything like that. No, simply because we believe humans are made in the image of God, we believe they have inexpressible worth and value. And then furthermore, when you look at what a human is actually created for, the creation narrative is pretty clear. Humans are created to rule over creation as God's partners, as God's sons and daughters. Like, God's vision for your life as a human being is that you have influence, that you have purpose, that you influence the world around you in a positive direction. Early on in the Jesus movement, some of the earliest followers of Jesus, they understood all human beings are created and they are given special gifts and talents from their creator. And we're supposed to discover those gifts and those talents, and then we're supposed to develop them to better help and serve other people. Like, the image that God has for a human being is that you would be someone who opposes injustice, that you would be someone who brings justice, that you would be someone who is a part of a global, diverse community of love, forgiveness, mercy, grace, that you would be someone who literally brings heaven to earth, that you extend the rule, the goodness, and the beauty of God to all of life. That is God's vision for a human being. I promise you, write down the perfect version of your life. Whatever it is, if you get all your dreams, if everything that you want to happen for your life were to come true, write it down, and I promise you, the vision that God has for your life is so much bigger, it's so much grander, and it's so much better. Because God isn't just thinking about what you experience, He's thinking about who you become, He's thinking about who you impact and who you influence, He's thinking about the legacy that you leave behind for generations to come. Like, God's vision for a human being is probably one of the most beautiful aspects of our faith. And right here in our story, Joseph is getting a glimpse of that. Joseph gets a dream from God. And Joseph didn't understand everything about it, but he understood this is a positive vision of my future. I really do believe God wants to give all of us a positive vision for our future. And I will just say this caveat really fast, because I know so often in your season of life, it is very tempting and very, some of you may feel like you have to have a 10-year plan for school, career, job, life, marriage, all of it. I totally understand that. But I would say that when we start talking about getting dreams and visions from God, God giving you a picture of your life, think bigger than just your job. Think bigger than just your career. I wholeheartedly want to help as many of you as we can to make wise decisions. I hope you make good money. I hope you have great relationships. I hope that you are very successful in your field, all of that. But the dream and the vision that God has for your life is so much bigger than just a career. It's so much bigger than just a job. When Joseph gets his dream, he actually didn't have the answer to a lot of questions that we would love answers to. He didn't know, okay, what do I do next year? What do I do the year after that? What track do I go down? He didn't know any of that. All he knew was God sees me, and God has a good plan for me. He gets a dream, but unfortunately, it causes even more trouble with his brothers. And this is where the story gets really, really bad and unfortunate. The narrator tells us that one day, Joseph's brothers are actually out in the fields. They are working. And Jacob and Joseph, Dad and Joseph, are back at home. And Dad tells Joseph, hey, I want you to go check on your brothers, okay? This is post-dream. I want you to go check on your brothers. So Joseph goes out to check on his brothers. And while he is on his way, I want you to look at what happens. When Joseph's brothers saw him coming, they recognized him in the distance. And as he approached, they made plans to kill him. Here comes the dreamer, they said. Come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns. We can tell our father a wild animal has eaten him. Then we'll see what becomes of his dreams. I'm not going to keep reading the chapter, but I will just briefly explain to you what happened. This is all Genesis chapter 37. Joseph is on his way, and the brothers devise up this plan to kill him. And then, obviously, you just read it. One of the brothers is named Reuben. Reuben hears what his other brothers are planning up, and Reuben says, hey guys, don't kill him. You really don't want, you don't want this blood on your hands. You don't want to commit murder. I understand that you hate him. I understand that you don't want him around, but let's not murder our brother, okay? So they say, all right, fine, whatever. Joseph gets there, and instead of murdering him, they throw him in a pit. They leave him kind of, in a little bit of a ditch, and then they continue on, and then shortly after Joseph is in the pit, some traders pass by, and by traders, I mean like people who trade things. And the brothers have this great idea where they go, okay, if we're not going to kill him, we don't want him around anymore. I don't want to hear about his stupid dreams where he's so successful. I don't want to keep on seeing dad spend the family's money to give him individual gifts. We don't want him around. So rather than kill him, let's just trade him. Let's sell him as if he's our slave. These people aren't going to know any better. They're not going to know the difference. And that's exactly what happens. They sell Joseph into slavery. They take the fancy coat that dad gave him. They dip it in blood. They take the coat back to dad and they say, it looks like your son was killed by a wild animal. It looks like he didn't make the trip that you sent him on. Dad is obviously heartbroken. He goes into mourning. The brothers now have to keep this secret within themselves from the rest of the family. Joseph is on his way to slavery. So Joseph, he gets a dream, but then he experiences a nightmare. And yet the question that I still want us to consider is, did you see God? Because one way of looking at the story of Joseph is you look at the introduction. Joseph is born into a dysfunctional family, okay? Maybe some of us feel like we can relate. Joseph is born into a family where there is a lot of arguing, there is favoritism, there is betrayal, there is lying. He has to deal with that on a daily basis. Furthermore, Joseph is abused, beaten by his brothers, and then sold into slavery. You can easily look at Joseph's life or be in Joseph's situation and go, life is horrible. This is not the way anybody would design or desire their life to be. It's very difficult. And yet, we have to do something about the dream. Like, we have to acknowledge it. We have to acknowledge that even though Joseph's life is not great, even though Joseph is having a lot of problems and a lot of challenges and a lot of difficulties, he still gets this dream. And he still has this vision of God giving him a positive picture for his life. He still has to wrestle with the fact that when he looks at his life situation, it is not currently the way that he wants it to be. But when he leans in and listens to the voice of God, there is a voice there that is saying, I have good plans for you. I want to somehow take your situation and your circumstance, and I want to use it for good. I want to actually make you and your life better. We have to acknowledge that even though it seems like, God, where are you in this story? There's still the dream. And you know, if you are with us on Wednesday nights, you know that normally Wednesday nights during the school year, there's a portion of the school year, we're in small group season right now, where if you were to show up Wednesdays at 6:30, we break off into groups and we talk about these messages and we try to figure out, you know, like, okay, what does that actually matter? Like, how does that apply to my life? What am I supposed to do about it? And stuff like that. And obviously conversations go everywhere and stuff. It's a great way to make friends. Normally that's what we would do on a Wednesday night. If you show up this Wednesday at 6:30, we're actually going to gather together in our lobby and then we're going to head over to Building A to be a part of our first Wednesday service with the rest of our church. So normally we would have a conversation about this, but since we're not gonna have a conversation at least this Wednesday, and I really feel like a message like this is one that you have to consider and think about when it comes to your life, I wanna give you a question. I wanna give you a question to think about as it relates to Joseph's story and what that might mean for your story. Here's the question, we'll throw it on the screen. Where in my life have I seen the goodness of God? Where in my life have I seen the goodness of God? For some of you, that question goes up there, and you can immediately start to think of a couple things. Just because of the environment that you've been raised in, because of the season of life that you're having, because of the experiences that you've had with the presence of God, like you're like, oh, I've seen him here, I've seen him here, I've seen him here. Maybe not as much as I wanted, maybe not as much right now, but you have moments where you have seen the goodness of God. If that is true, can I encourage you, maybe you tell someone that this week. Maybe you bring up this conversation with a parent, with a sibling, with a leader, with a friend, and you just ask, hey, where have you seen the goodness of God in your life? You listen to their answer, or you tell them your answer, and let the stories of God's faithfulness, let it encourage you. Let it inspire you for the future. But for some of us, I throw that question up there, and your immediate reaction is, not much. Maybe your story, or maybe just your season of life, feels more like Joseph's, where right now you feel like you have a lot more to be frustrated about than you do to be thankful for. And I want to encourage you, a question like this, let it bring up all the emotions that you might have in response. Let it frustrate you. Let it sadden you. Let it anger you. Let it make you curious. But I want to challenge you that if you honestly look at your life, you take an honest look, you try to become as objective as you possibly can, you try to take the hurt or the frustration that you currently feel and just, you let it live there, you let it be, but you try to look at your life as honestly as you can, could there perhaps be some activity that maybe can be attributed to the goodness of God? For some of you, maybe God's given you an intellect that right now you currently are using to try to disprove him or explain him away. But he's given you that. For some of you, maybe it's the charisma that God has given you that normally you use that to get people to like you. But it's a gifting, it's a talent that God has actually given you. For some of you, you have actually had moments, even if they're long ago, even if now you look back and you kind of doubt them and you're a little unsure, but you have had moments where you walked away from that moment saying, I experienced the presence of God. I got a word from God. I got a picture from God. Even though it's long ago, even though it feels irrelevant or you're disconnected from it now, if you're honest, it was a moment that you can look back to. For some of you, maybe God has given you a couple people in your life who you just know they are there for me. I can make a dumb decision, and you know what? Whether or not they say, I told you so, they're still going to be there. Maybe you don't have everyone in your life that you wish you did, but there's still someone who you know is there as a representative of the goodness and the faithfulness of God. You see, for Joseph, all he had to hold on to, it was a dream. At this point in his story, this is probably where many of us would write God off. God, you are too far away. You are not involved enough. You should have done more. Where are you? Because literally all Joseph had to hold on to was a dream. It was just this promise that God somehow sees me and wants to improve my life, wants to bless me, wants to grow me, wants to change me. All he had was a dream. Now, will that be enough to actually carry Joseph through what is going to become the most difficult season of his life? Well, that's exactly where we're going to pick up the story next week in part 2 of Did You See God?